So what I want to do is outline some prerequisites that are very important to understanding what is going on in the Gaza conflict right now. Now, I remember years ago I had a friend of mine, and he was a Muslim friend, and we were discussing Europe, and he told me something that pretty much shocked me. He said that the Holocaust really didn't happen, that was just propaganda. And I was shocked, and of course I gave my evidence for that. But he was convinced. Now, this wasn't a man that was not educated. He had a PhD in engineering. He was very well educated, very smart, but yet believed something that was obviously not true. The question is, why? Why was he believing this thing that was not true? Well, I want to provide some historical circumstances to help explain this. And I think these are some historical circumstances that really helps to understand what is going on right now in Gaza. Now, this is not a holistic understanding. This is a very nuanced, very complicated situation. But what I want to do in this talk is give you some prerequisites that I think are important to begin to understand the topic. And we start with events in 7th century. What we have is a very one-sided account of what happened between Muhammad and the Jews. There's virtually no history that will confirm any Jewish understanding of what happened. All the surviving accounts of Muhammad's conflicts with the Jews are in the religious sources of Islam. So that's important for judging this historically. And there's no conclusive historical evidence that'll really kind of give us any concrete ideas. But one thing we can be sure of is some of the things that come out of that, out of the Quran, that puts a very derogatory understanding of the Jews. What we find here are things like they're deceitful, they're treaty breakers, they're forgers of sacred texts, they're Sabbath violators who were turned into apes and pigs. Now, these are claims that were provided in that 7th century. And so what we can determine here, that all these ideas can be traced back to the Quran and other early religious texts. Secondly, early attempts to put a spin on Muhammad's conflicts with the Jews. In other words, for instance, Tariq Fada says that early centuries after Muhammad's death, certain powerful groups, especially the descendants of the Meccans, who opposed Muhammad, had a reasons to paint a negative portrait of the Jews. And certainly that is a possibility. But I think the evidence is lacking there. And I think an evidential account is in order. 3, long Muslim political and religious tradition of discrimination and prejudice. Now, virtually all religions have some sort of prejudice against or maybe a certain level of disdain for non-believers. And historically, that is translated to a negative feeling towards the Jews who were really rejecting the message of Muhammad. They were fervently rejecting the message of Muhammad more than the Christians. And so that's why in the Quran you will find a more negative view of the Jews than the Christians in the Quran, okay? And so we have that aspect as well. 4, the importation of European anti-Semitism. Now, European anti-Semitism probably produced the worst display of hatred towards the Jews that culminated in the Holocaust. And this European anti-Semitism took place decades and centuries before the Holocaust took place. And so I think it's important to understand that. They had extreme hatred for the Jews. Some Christian missionaries and later non-religious anti-Semites added false accusations against the Jews. And you will see that. Of the long history of anti-Semitism, you will see false accusations and efforts to dehumanize them. So it's not just Islam. I think that's important. I'm dealing with one part of anti-Semitism, and that's how it comes from Islam. But there are many guilty parties. We've had in today global progressivism, as we've seen in our universities, is a bastion for anti-Semitism, even at some of our finest universities in the United States. So what I'm doing here is just dealing with one aspect of this important topic. During the Nazi era, for instance, particularly from 1937 to 1945, there was a significant attempt to build alliances with Germany, with Arabs and Muslims, and to spread this anti-Semitism to the Middle East. Okay? So there is that influence. Next is the impact of Zionism. Now, Zionism seeks to, it's the effort to have the Jews have their homeland once again. And originally, it was there to counteract anti-Semitism. That's why the Zionist movement came to be. Now, there is definitely resistance towards that. But after the Ottoman Empire declined and colonial rule ended, Arab nationalism began to grow. And it became clear that conflict over land would escalate among these groups. It was believed by many Muslim countries the Jews did not have a rightful place in this land. Now, if you think about the whole Middle East, it's almost all Muslim. But the Jews were wanting a piece of land that really only amounts to a piece of land the size of New Jersey. But yet, they did not, they should not do that. And there are reasons why we'll impact later. And so this strained relationships, and this caused a lot of problems. Then there was the rise of Islamicism. Now, this was kind of like the back to Sharia movement. And so what was the problem? The problem for them was that Islam was deviating from its teaching. And so they codified American or European style of government. And so Sharia was not the total law of the land anymore. It was sort of a mixture. And so there was a response to that. And that began with the Wahhabi movement in the 18th century, Arabia. Later there is the Wahhabi movement is like the movement that really controls Saudi Arabia. So if you think of, well, what's the Wahhabi movement? Think of Saudi Arabia. Very strict rules, and more strict than many other Muslim countries. That turned into what's called the Salafist approach, which stressed the return to Islamic practices. And what it did was it stressed Muhammad's negative interactions with the Jews. And so this fueled some hatred. Other movements that came about, you have the Muslim Brotherhood. Now this was a movement founded in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, and he became increasingly anti-Jewish during World War II, partly due to his association with the Grand Mufti. And finally, there was Sayyid Qutb. Qutb played a significant role in solidifying anti-Semitism in the mid-20th century. And so Qutb's extremist ideas gained acceptance among more Muslims, and anti-Semitism began to spread. Next, there's the intensification of Palestinian nationalism. Now, originally, Arab nationalism was quite similar across the region. However, something happened in the 20th century. A unique Palestinian identity emerged, and this was partly a response to interactions with Zionists and Israel, and partly because the Arab countries would not accept Palestinians. Those in Egypt and those in Jordan refused to accept them. They thought when you have them come into your country, you're going to invite trouble. So it's very important to understand this idea and some of the historical things that transpired. But it wasn't until the 1960s and the 1970s that Palestinian nationalism was sort of it was broader than Arab nationalism. Of course, we see that today, even in our American universities, this Palestinian nationalism called for and having a vitriol response to Israel. And so this is where this comes from. But next is the political failures in the Arab world. Remember, Islam promises success to those who follow Allah, who yield to Allah. And it promises success in this life and the life to come. Those who do not follow Allah, there's judgment in this life, in the life to come. And therefore, you have winners and losers. Israel is supposed to be the losers of history. Then you see the Six-Day War in 1967, and it became apparent to Arab nationalists, different anti-Zionist ideas, that it produced a very unexpected result. Why did Israel not only win the war, but won it so quickly? So there was a lot of different failures there that took place in the Arab world, and the most obvious defeat took place at the hands of the Jewish state, when the Jews were able to have their own homeland in 1948. Then there is the success of extremism. You have Iran, a country I nearly and dearly love, and but there is some extremist elements that came up through Khomeini and Hezbollah. Hezbollah, of course, is more a formidable force in Lebanon, but they have caused havoc in the world. You had the PLO. They were an extremist organization. PLO is the Palestinian Liberation Organization by Arafat, and it became more prominent and respected a lot because of its terrorist attacks. You have Afghanistan. You have Al-Qaeda. All of these sort of extremist groups arose and exacerbated the conflict. So we have to understand this issue in totality, okay? And we cannot label all Muslims as anti-Semitism. No. What we have to do is look when it's a response to an issue like this there's history involved, and we need to understand that history and to make corrections accordingly. Now, there's a psychological aspect to this Islamic anti-Semitism. Again, I told you about the success. Islam is to be the winners of history. Jews are being the losers of history. Muslims faced numerous attacks in the 20th century, and it was clear that Islam was not as successful as Israel was in the 20th century. That is quite a hit on one's worldview. Why is that? And so the result, they adopted beliefs that portrayed Jews negatively to answer that. But this is another point. This is the era of social media. And if you follow social media, is Muslims, this is not a blanket statement, but a lot of Muslim social media has to do with the idea of portraying Israel as the enemy, and very negatively. And so that is ongoing. So most Muslims are following some aspects of this social media, and that message about the Jews and Israel is reinforced on a daily basis. So that's another consideration. But you also have to understand that this is a very nuanced view. You can't say Muslims in a generic way and think it encompasses all of it. Not the case. Not the case at all. Now, what I'm trying to do is add some historical context to this. I think it's very understand to not broad brush individual Muslims in holding these ideas. So necessarily a bunch of people who are anti-Semitic. But there is an element of anti-Semitism in Islam that I think needs to be addressed, because it has real world consequences. And so I wanted to outline that, but I would love to dialogue with you as well. Feel free to reach out to me, and hopefully we can have some very fruitful conversations. I hope this information was helpful to you. Thank you.